Welcome back to Forward Cloud Tech. This is Security Tools Don't Fix Security Issues, People Do. How to Make Compliance Data Relatable and Actionable by Thoden van Velzen and Andrea Edwards. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, especially our silver sponsor, ClearVector. ClearVector helps you prepare for, detect, investigate, and stop threats in your AWS environment. Our real-time identity-driven approach enables you to quickly figure out who did it and to take action. Get started today with a free real-time risk assessment of your AWS environment. With that, take it away, Jay and Andrea.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody. It's so great to be with you, even if it's virtual. We wish we could have done this in person, and a variety of circumstances made that not possible. But I hope everybody has a fantastic conference, as well as the ones watching via live stream. Let's get in. So a little bit about the team real quick before we get into the heart of the material. So we present the SAP's SecDevOps team, which really is SecOps in a DevOps way. That is sometimes a bit confusing, especially when you're hiring, and that basically means 20 minutes of our hiring is explaining what we do and why that's not DevSecOps. Even though, of course, we use DevSecOps in our own practices for full inception of SecOps in a DevSecOps way, if that helps. So we started in a team in 2019 of around 5 people when we only had about 2 million resources in the landscape. Over the last couple of years, that has grown. So by the end of last year, we were at 16 and we're at 23 today. So that team has grown dramatically, not with the scale of the cloud itself. That's actually increased tenfold over time. We're spread around the globe with members in China, Singapore, Germany, UK, and the US across 7 different time zones, 10 nationalities, and we're very happy to say that it's a reasonably diverse group as well. Our main responsibilities are to run compliance scans across about 12,500 cloud accounts across 6 different cloud providers, and that is quite challenging, as I think this group understands, especially when it comes to the variety of the cloud providers, but also the scale that we run into. We also run jointly with our STS Global Security Operations, which is the team that handles security incident response for the entire company, including data center, laptops, cell phones, and all of that, where we work together on incidents in public cloud, where we bring our domain expertise to bear. We also help with developer and DevOps tooling and enablement. That comes as part of the team. And we run in very close partnership with our SAP Global Security Organization in terms of policy, operations, and of course, security incident response. And to give maybe a bit of sense of like how we do things, we recently found the Autonomic Security Operations document from Iman Ghanizadeh and Dr. Anton Chivakin that was published middle of last year. And had a bit of a gasp when we came to this particular section and realized, like, wait, that's what we do. So, you know, that maybe gives you a sense of where to place us. Next slide. So another important thing is that SAP is multi-cloud as an a priori strategic decision. This was a business executive decision, not anything to do with like, oh, let's pick the right cloud for the right technology or anything like that. It was based on a historical way of how SAP does things. You could get ERP in about every database that you want, at least historically. And this kind of follows the same practice where SAP doesn't pick winners. Customers do, and our customers have their own preferences for which public cloud provider we might use. we follow this 4+1 strategy, which consists of the 4 global cloud providers, or the 3 that everybody knows, in Alibaba Cloud, as well as SAP's own cloud infrastructure. But we really like to say 6 because AWS and Azure China both are dramatically different from their global counterparts, may not have the same version of the API, or may not have certain capabilities that we can rely on in global to get it done. So we really treat them as separate. Since cloud use became really a thing within SAP, that was around like 2017 or so, we've been doubling the use of public cloud every year. And that runs now in, tens of millions. I think that roughly around 20, 25 million or so. But it's always hard to actually calculate exactly how much that is. We are at least aware of maybe the sense of scale of some 5 million IAM objects only across these cloud providers. We're still in the midst of a further acceleration of cloud migration, which is actually kind of scary because you're already going like that, and we're adding more. And the idea is that by the end of the year, something like 70% of all SAP infrastructure runs in public cloud. We also stretch the limits of cloud providers daily through just running our compliance scans. So like for us, the cloud is not limitless. It's literally like, okay, we're always kind of at the end of it. And in some cases, we even do joint demand planning with the cloud providers to make sure that there's enough of it. We're part of a multi-cloud team that's more than just security. So this is a group that handles centrally sort of the governance and key things around public cloud uses within the company. So everybody has to come through us, get a central billing goes through us. You have to get the cloud account from us so that we know that it exists, and have a number of other functions as well. When it comes to security specifically, we work closely with our colleagues in network and security architecture and SecDevOps. That's really the team that we represent. Next slide. SAP is a really large organization. It has over 105,000 employees. It has 8 different board areas and multiple business units in between. So you see a little bit of the numbers of the number of business units, and it actually goes 8 layers deep. So when you see that L4, like that's not the end of it. Much of this lives within, of the cloud usage lives, of course, within the development organizations that's separated between product and platform board areas. But that still gives us about 6% of cloud accounts are used by everybody else in the organization. And that includes, demo systems, pre-sales, internal systems, marketing solutions. Even our global finance and administration runs cloud accounts. So that gives a very wide variety of skill sets and type of people that we're working with. In some cases, there might be whole, developer teams, but all kinds of cloud native experiences. In some cases, it may just be someone that quickly needs a VM to do a demo for a customer, and perhaps the level of cloud maturity and skill level that is involved with that obviously shifts dramatically between different parts of the organization. Another important thing is that it's an organization that's in constant flux. So we probably have about 2 significant organizational changes that might affect 1 or 2 board areas at least every year. But there are changes through that organization, of course, within business units as needs require. But also people simply drift away, like they get jobs somewhere else, they move to a different team, and making sure that you manage that change within a cloud security context is actually not simple at all. Next slide. So another kind of tricky thing is, and I want to be sensitive of course, all of our corporate sponsors, so none of this really applies to, but in general, I think a lot of the cybersecurity tooling that exists is not particularly good. When it comes to the cloud, that gets even harder because that itself is still maturing. So we all know about false positives. Everybody hates false positives. False positives destroy trust, makes your users hate you, and that nobody wants to send people out off on a wild goose chase for something that turns out to actually be okay. And what we've seen in the past is that when you identify false positives, the fixed timelines may not align with yours. We've had a case where at some point we had to deal with 8 different controls that we had to temporarily turn off simply because we were waiting on vendor fixes. So that's a really difficult thing. But even so, that's something that we have to live with. Another challenge that we have is that we have a lot of custom policies and controls. We're a large organization that needs to cover various regulations across the globe. SOC 2 is nice, but it's certainly not the only thing that we have to take care of. There's GDPR, there's critics in C5, there's regulations in China and other places in the world. And as a result, we often need to modify the policies that are baked in. And that operational effort by itself is quite difficult, especially because each of the tools may operate in a different way. I think everybody in this audience knows that a lot of the security tooling in the cloud is still, maybe in transition, where it's a traditional tool set that's being pushed in the cloud, or maybe it's new, but there's only a few of them that are maybe doing it the second time around stuff. So everybody's still working through it. And look, we've done this ourselves. We're building on top of Chef Inspect, so we know how hard it is to get security tooling right in the cloud, but it also means that we have very high expectations. And we see a lot of suites of acquired solutions that sometimes are integrated with different levels of success. And while there are some cloud provider services from the CSPs themselves that are fantastic, there's others that are maybe not so good. The multi-cloud coverage in many cases is still emerging, and it's really from maybe the last year or so. Where I think we actually have the most challenges is not even in those aspects, because at some point you just have to work with what you got, is that just having good signals or good detection is not actually enough. Can it scale, and is it deployable in a realistic way, right? Is it affordable? Can we do things by deploying it across an entire landscape with organizational policies, or is it something that we need to ask every cloud account owner to ask permission for it? I think that's where a lot of the challenges comes in a large organization. And perhaps the worst aspect, and really the heart of what our talk is about, is this lack of context. So there's no ability really to import important organizational contextual metadata into security tooling, even the best ones. So unfortunately, that means that virtually everything becomes ultimately just a scan engine where we get the data out and then then apply that organizational context to it. It's great that we have things that can read from the landscape, sometimes even in multiple aspects, and bring a security vulnerability, a compliance violation, an IAM misconfiguration all together and provide a risk score. But that doesn't help if I don't know where that lives. Is that a production landscape? Does that belong to some demo environment? Is it containing customer data? What is really going around with that landscape that tells me the context of what it is, and how do we even know who that particular resource or cloud account is owned by? We have spoken with vendors that rely on reading tags on resources, but when you have millions of resources already deployed, and some of these attributes only really apply on a cloud account level or subscription or project level, then are we really going to ask an entire organization to sort of, re-tag like all of their landscape with some agreed terms? That's not really a realistic option. Andrea.
All right. So we're going to talk about our policies. We have our own custom policies from our defensive architecture team that encompasses security regulations from across the globe, both regional and global, from SOC 2 to C5 and many other regulations. We have to have those policies set that set the standards that cover most use cases other than PCI and DSS, which are plans to a handful. These policies are adjusted and changed frequently to allow for threats and sharpening of those policies due to fixes or whether or not there's an elevation of something new. We have to be flexible, and in response, this code is implemented, and which has to have a very clear pass-fail condition in order for it to be inspected and audited. This forces the policy to be very clear and explicit because being vague is not an option. And the code is meant to be clear and set standards of what's pass and fail and what's expected for these accounts and resources that we have in the cloud. For our tooling, it's basically an enablement for the dev teams to use our ad hoc scans, which can be deployed in used in deployed landscapes for remediation purposes, or it could be a part of their own pipeline or development cycles to test to see whether or not there's issues that would cause their build to be failed. And it's kind of like a quality check to say, make sure that everything is running and will be compliant once it's done and being deployed. We also do our essential scans, which we do, and then we share with the entire organization. So this is our release process in a whole. So for example, there may be a particular policy decision and, or maybe there's a new control that needs to be written into policy. So what we'll do with that, we'll run it through the test suite. If it passes, then it goes through to the code review. And then it goes back to SGS. And this kind of implies that that the code is already ready for the policy decision, for the code to be, it means that it's implementable and should be able to be passed the process itself. If it fails, then we know something wrong and we need to tweak and change as needed. The process then goes to the policy review. And we want to make sure that everything is okay. If it's not okay, then it needs to go back and we need to revise. If it is okay, then it goes back into the release plan and we go from there. We notify our stakeholders, excuse me, that there is a policy change coming. And if we have the pre-prod scan data, we can then give them an estimate of what the impact of this change will be. Prior to the actual release, once everything is good to go, it goes off to our SGS team, who then give their final sign-off, and that triggers the release that we roll out. All right, so now we're looking at our compliance as code detective controls. This is basically a combination of the consumer container and the central scan, where the same compliance code is usable for both developers to run their own ad hoc scans, and then ideally when they're developing, to get those that early kind of quality check, and as well as for our central scans, which is running on Kubernetes that checks the entire deployed landscape. It brings the data into the pipeline and enriches the process. We then push it out into our scene for their analysis, which could lead to security incident response, depending on what the data is saying. We also push it into our central reporting and our dashboards that allows organizations to follow with the developer teams and make sure they're being watched and being compliant as well.
Very good. Thank you, Andrea.
Hmm.
So this sense of being watched is actually really important. It's not to be annoying, but like we're all like cloud security professionals, we care about security. I wish everybody cared as much about security as we do. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And let's just realize that's true, right? Like developer teams have a variety of competing priorities, so do their managers. And if they don't super care about these things or are made to care, then it's a lot harder to get things to move. We talk to developer teams who would be perfectly happy to follow up on and make their landscapes fully and 100% in compliance with all policies, but they also need to have the time to do so and a managerial support that understands that that might be in this moment in time more important than some of the other things that you might want. So the point really is to get data into the hands of those who can act, and those are of course the people that manage the landscape directly, but it's also the people that can authorize those people to do it or can allocate the time to do so. So the team may not themselves own all of the priorities. So by going through the entire hierarchy and making sure that it's that the priorities are understood at all levels, that's really what this maybe spaghetti diagram is trying to express. With through the middle, you really see the organizational hierarchy of product development or anybody that's in an organization that uses cloud accounts. And on the left side, you see essentially the security organization with the chief security officer reporting to the CEO, the CISO really interacting with the sort of next layer level, as well as with the BISO, so Business Information Security Officer, maybe easier to think of business unit information security officers that have a direct relationship or are tied to a particular business unit lead in an organization. And they themselves may run central security teams that follow up. And those are often the ones that we then interact with, share information with them, that then can share that back out to their organizational leads and make sure that they understand that this is actually a priority. An interesting aspect in there as well as the board area COO office. We'll get to that a little later near the end, where people that keep track of security KPIs who themselves are not security people, but this, here's a metric and that number needs to go down or that percentage compliant rate needs to go up. That's what they track and then bring that down into that managerial hierarchy. So that's very good. And then on the right side, you have the various audit functions that happen in the organization. So this creates this mutual layers of accountability to make sure that alerts are actually followed up on rather than simply just scanned and recorded.
All right. So basically, this is going over the importance of the cloud asset data. This comes into play so we can associate the right information and send to the right people. So in September 2020, after it became clear that after we started sending out alerts that they were either went to the wrong people or people had left the organization, and that was something that needed to be fixed. So we now require all account metadata to be updated at least every 6 months. It can happen more frequently, and it can be done by API. This is required so we have all the organizational context and can keep track of personal changes because people may not necessarily tell you or update the information, or maybe they switch teams, and not all of our cloud systems our cloud landscapes are integrated, so those authorizations are done as well. So I guess in order to keep this as a compliance thing, any failure to update the account can result into locking and or deletion of the cloud account, which we've never had to do. I think the threat is enough. So it's always at the final stage that somebody will either say, yeah, it needs to be deleted, we no longer need it, or somebody will go in and update their information so they can keep the account. And basically, we have two critical named people on the account owners and the security officer. And they have the purpose of being directly accountable for all activities in the account or the security of it. Security officer basically holds the account owner responsible. And in most cases, this is more of an administrative role, but they can delegate responsibility to others. They're more personally responsible to make sure it's done correctly. And it's often a good thing that somebody is this particular person is a senior person. And then we also derive organizational hierarchy from the cost object, which means that the billing info needs to be correct as well. Basically, nobody wants to bill for something they don't own or don't use, so it makes it a little bit easier as well. Basically, the point of all of this is to allow us to look up every day and have that organizational hierarchy information correct. And we can pick up those changes. Once we have all that in play and everything's updated, we can pick up organizational changes pretty quickly and associate these organizational changes with the correct alerts and make sure they still go to the right place, and if not, to the right person. And if we can find the right person, we can find the right organization, and they can follow up and make sure that the new account owners, if necessary, are assigned. We also have attributes specifically for security around what type of environment it is, and whether or not it has is for PCI or any type of thing like that. So whether or not it's tagged for that customer data or that privacy data, which would indicate any type of developer intent. It may not necessarily describe what's actually going on, but it at least gives us something to reflect on and reference if something shows it's exposed in our scans, but it's supposed to be private. So if something exposed, we know that obviously they meant for it not to be exposed, and that gives us another reason to follow up through the organization to see if all of that information was really correct. All right, so this is showing our compliance scanning as a whole. This is a diagram that shows kind of how everything fits together. It starts with our compliance as code running through Chef Inspect from within a Kubernetes deployment on GCP. Then the scans run through pre-processing, and we add the data enrichment from our multi-cloud database, which I was just talking about, and that gets reflected daily in the call center. So we always have that information there. This really allows us to add any organizational context to the scan at ingestion point. This is really important because we can show the state of the organization at any given time. And it can be reorganized to the current situation, allows us to see over time the history of that cloud account and how it moves through the organization. At the ingestion point So we associate the state of the organization at the ingestion point. So when you have the history, you can follow the alerts through the whole process as the organization changes. For example, we did have a line of business that decided to rename and restructure things. We didn't really have to do anything on the back end because the alerts adjusted themselves to the organization without anybody having to do any back end work. So having all that information correct, having it updated is super important to what we do. Then to complete the process, it goes into our storage and search. And from there, it goes into our SIEM and informs it any security incident response, and then into various data outputs. Okay. And now these are all of our different data outputs that we may use in the company. And it shows like an overview of the various teams and levels of the organizations that need this information or may use this information. This may just give us like an overall view of the type of input we have across the top of it, and then the levels of the organization that use the information. And really whether or not the information used is for technical teams and it's detailed, or it's just more of information that needs to be passed on. So some of these outputs require some sign up, or you can get it secondhand because you're probably not an account owner. But you can also either have the output, you can sign up for the output or have it run the container, and then you can get the information either way. The data exports are really the most broad from an alert perspective because it goes all the way up to the COO, where they can just kind of do their matrix and their data scanning on their own and redistribute those alerts and data as they need. And they can keep the teams below them accountable and honest. And the auditing compliance teams can then verify that data with us if the teams themselves are telling them the right information. And yeah, so the executive update goes to the senior leadership and SGS leadership, so we can talk more freely about what we think is going on and where we might need some help. And then we have our executive status reporting, which is a little bit more broadly. It's readily available to everybody, and but you have to get on like a distribution list, so we don't have that email and information going to everybody into the organization. We also have API access, which is more in line with the compliance report mailers, but also helps give central security teams the ability to build their own automation, follow-up, and remediation processes. And they can do that in Jira or ServiceNow to teams that actually can follow up on that information. So pretty much everybody has access, of course, through our dashboards, which anybody can always see. They can just log in and see it, see what's going on. And if anybody has any complaints or issues with it or not really understanding what's going on, we're always there to kind of help with any issues and with any questions or complaints.
Let's get to the demo.
Let's do that. All right. So let me see if I can switch real quick and move this over here. Here's this. All right. So this is a little really simplified version of what we do in terms of the controls and whatnot. So you'll want to kind of explains our process in a very, very, very simplified way. But however, this is an example of one of the controls that we would use, and it has a very set format and template to follow. And we want to be like super clear on what the control is looking for, where and whatnot. And so we know exactly what's passing, what's failing. All right, so we might have to a little bit here. So the next part, it goes into our Kibana, basically. That control data that we had previously in the other screen is fed into Kibana, and this is where we verify our scans, we do our quality checks prior to release. We also have our error dashboard, which comes in handy in terms of keeping an eye on our data and making sure that everything's working like it should. And if anything is a little off, we kind of come here and kind of compare what we see in our numbers and what errors are showing up as well. We also use Kibana for our visualization and access. We give access to some of our partners so they can do some self-checking on their own. All right, let me go back a little bit. Press play. So these are dashboards, which everybody has access to. And they can come in here and drill down by their business unit and kind of see over the course of the week and our double scans during the week, or if they're going to want to check how they've been doing in the past as well. This, as they drill down, the information gets more tailored and a little bit more specific. And they can also use this dashboard to keep track of any trends, any history, all of that good stuff is in here. And I think we're just going to kind of scroll through this here. But yeah, that's pretty much how that looks. But yeah, and the next step is just making sure everybody's honest and doing what they need to do. let me pull up our where is it at? There we go. All right.
Here we go. And I think we're getting a little bit short on time, so I'll go real quick. This gives you a bit of a view of the status report that we share weekly. So some of the charts are actually from the same dashboards that you see before, but there's some additional pieces to track over time. Next slide. And we built a whole bunch of organizational support structures that we're actually really proud of. So we started in August 2019 already with our Multicloud Security Office Hour. So this is where every Tuesday morning for me and afternoon, so twice a day, we have an hour call where lines of businesses, the security teams, and really anybody that wants to be informed about anything cloud security in the organization gets to walk through that status report, and also ask any questions that they may have, and interact directly with both the STS policy team as well as ourselves, which really helps things. The board area delegate and BISO call is really where we bring that organizational hierarchy in to make sure that the managerial organization is informed and also understands the priorities. And of course, our developer enablement, whether it's through tooling or through wider dissemination of cloud security best practices and so on through the organization. And of course, there's a lot of opportunities when you work through scans or through security incidents with teams to talk directly about stuff. Next slide. Another thing is, and that probably won't surprise anybody in this audience, is that the policy velocity is very high. It's probably the, without question, actually, the fastest changing security policy in the entire company, but that's largely because of the pace of the platform, the changes in the APIs, and any scalability issues may even change things. So we actually recently changed some storage bucket policies to have to be bucket wide because it's simply not realistic and scalable for us to check each storage object, or we would never complete the scans. Another really important thing that drives that policy velocity is through the office hours feedback, where you work directly with developer teams that have an idea. They may think they may need an exception. Suddenly there's other teams that are on the call that say, hey, I have that same problem. We can work through edge cases, get an initial assessment done, and that's much easier than having to go to some form to formally start a process. So this makes that much, much quicker. And this is, I think, especially more recently, where we see a lot of refinement of the policies. And the fast fix turnaround, because when we find something, it's already policy as code, everybody can inspect it. We very quickly find why it might not work, add a condition, and releases out. Like I think some of the big ones get turned around like within a day. So it's really, we had to shorten our release cycle to make sure that we got releases out fast enough for our LOB internal stakeholders, not to ask us like, but you said it was fixed. Next slide. Is this effective? Yes, it is. It's been fantastically effective, and we've been very proud that we've dropped alert numbers 3 years in a row, even though the landscape kept growing in size and the number of cloud resources deployed tenfold. We've also seen increasingly that the community buy-in and trust that we've built really helps make this work well. And these support structures are increasingly institutionalized, where people are simply expected to be there, and people get onboarded onto them simply because they get into this function. Probably the biggest compliment that we had is that it's increasingly a model for other policies areas to adopt, so outside of cloud specifically. And we've had our internal customers, in fact, going to the policy organizations, security organizations, say like, make it more work like what these guys do, which probably is about as good as it gets. And I think with that, we're literally at the last minute.
So the first question we had is, with the scale that you operate in, what methods have you found to minimize shadow IT and make sure that compliance is covering the full ecosystem that you have?
So first of all, we have, like, by policy, every cloud account has to come from within the SAP organization, within that particular cloud provider. And remember that cloud account lifecycle management. You have to get the cloud account through the multi-cloud team. If you do not get it through multi-cloud team, it is a corporate violation, and there is no way for the company to pay for whatever you've done, right? So that's a very strong one. So you either get it through us, and therefore we have full insight into it, can deploy tool across that entire landscape. If you decide to be stupid, you'll be fired and have a bill. That's quite useful. That works.
And then do your team members specialize in particular cloud technologies? And then how do you build a shared understanding of how a particular control objective should work across the different providers?
So the policy intent is defined by the security team. So that's really about, like, what do we want to achieve? So let's say every bucket should be encrypted, right? Where it comes down with us is like, what does that mean on a particular cloud provider? So the policy itself they're structured, but like there's separate ones for AWS, Azure, GCP, Ali, that express what that policy intent is in the practical term for that platform. That translate directly into the control. So obviously the control on GCP for bucket policies is different than the control for especially Azure.
And then how do you connect the data to incentives to act? So what do you say to a board member or a business unit lead to make number of findings and vulnerability scans sort of seen as something that's relevant to the business?
It's actually, like, the good thing is we've had a very good chief security officer and CISO pair that have been able to educate the executive board very well. I think our biggest challenge is not so much on the executive board or on the developer teams and sort of BISO teams. It's that piece that sit in the middle that is sometimes a lot harder to motivate.
And then sort of final question. Sort of it looks like it's a ton of work to maintain the different like outputs, and this output is destined for these two people as the primary consumer, but with transparency or FY to these others. For those of the smaller teams that don't quite have the same complexity, like how do you prioritize, and what do you think gets the most use and delivers the most value?
So that's always difficult to do, because we can set sort of what we know from an organizational perspective, from what we see across the entire landscape, and how we disseminate that out through the different organizations. But it's often different teams make their own decisions, right? So we can say, like, this is the state of your landscape. We'd like it to be better, but how they ultimately achieve that better is more up to the teams to decide. Of course, if there's no progress, we'll come after you. But there is quite a lot of autonomy within the teams to figure out how they get that done. There's SLA, so there's certain expectations. But we'd rather have somebody on a roadmap to improvements rather than have battles, if you see what I mean.
Great. Thank you very much to Jay and Andrea. And we will be back here at 2 o'clock for Human versus Robot, why you should automate your vulnerability management program. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great conference.